teacher manifesto at page 8, and refer members also to tabled items today. Can I give a warm welcome to Maxine Murphy-Higgins from NASUT, Marie O'Shea Into, Alison Steen, UTU, Graham Gault, NIHT, and Alastair Donaghy, NEU. Can I advise witnesses that in total you have a maximum of 10 minutes to make an opening statement or comments, followed by questions from members? And obviously we are tight for time this morning, so if everyone can be as concise on the key issues as possible, that'll help us cover as many of them as we can. Can I hand over to the NITC then, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members. Thank you for inviting us to attend today. I'm Maxine Murphy-Higgins from the NISUWT, and you have already commented on who else we have with us from the other members of the NITC. On behalf of the Education Trade Union Group of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, I wrote to the Minister on the 26th of November 21, and I copied that same correspondence to the committee here, and to date we have had no reply to that correspondence. We subsequently raised these concerns with the Department of Education and Education Authority officials last Thursday, and they advised that they would take our points away. Therefore, we particularly welcome this opportunity to raise with you the concerns that we have for our members in schools. And I should also say at the outset is those of us in the NITC do believe that the best place for our children is in school. So that is the starting point. But we also believe that it has to be done safely, and that we need to minimise the amount of spread there is of COVID within our schools presently. As I've said, we are very concerned about the increased levels of COVID amongst our school community, both amongst pupils and staff. We would ask that the Executive and the Department of Education give instructions that mass gatherings do not happen. Schools are being put under pressure by communities to have business as normal, but we know it's not safe to do so. We also understand that where schools are competing for pupils, they will want to hold open days and open evenings. P7 taster days. For example, this Friday, one post-primary school is planning on having 500 P7 pupils into their school. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, there is no risk assessment completed for that event. Another aspect we raised with the Minister is in the mitigations for those who were previously shielding. We all know that shielding is paused, but the Northern Ireland Government are still advising our citizens who were previously shielding to minimise their risks by limiting household contacts, keeping social interactions as low as possible, and following the social distancing guidelines. They are advised to go to hospitality at quieter times, but the Northern Ireland Government, in relation to those who are working at schools, none of these mitigations are possible. They are also our previously shielding members are also being encouraged to abandon the mitigations in view of getting back to normal and provide school as normal. The NI government advice is for CB people to work from home where possible. The difficulty for our members is at the minute, not only is working from home not possible, and we know the difficulties there is with getting sub teachers, but they are also encouraged to carry on, as we've said, as normal, without social distancing, without keeping the numbers low, etc. I'm going to also, that's what I will say, those are the two main points I would want to make, and I'm going to pass over to Graham Gault, who will make further points. Thank you.
Graham, I think you might. Yep. Maxine, do you maybe want to pass to the next Marie, person? We'll come back to Graham, yeah?
Yes, please. Marie, would you be able to come in now, please?
Sorry. Graham's back. Will we go with Graham? Yeah, thanks, Graham.
You can hear me okay now? Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, we go back to the last time we were at the committee, NITC were at the committee. It was just when contact tracing was being taken back by PHA. Since then, the rates of transmission have increased many times. And I would just like to, again, on behalf of NITC and all of the teachers and the school leaders who we represent, say again that the current arrangements for contact tracing, the current definitions for what exactly is a close contact, meaning if you're a child who's been sitting all day, every day, beside a child who's a positive case in school, you're still not identified as a close contact. And indeed, the isolation guidance, we believe these things are contributing to the very high rates of transmission that we've been seeing. And the rates of transmission over the past 4 weeks have really been shocking. The official figures show that for 10 to 14-year-olds, it's 1,672 positive cases per 100,000. For 5 to 9-year-olds, 1,200 positive cases per 100,000. I mean, these figures are really startling and just demonstrate what we've been panicking about, so anxious about for the past number of months, that we just have an environment in our schools that just seems to be conducive to the spread of this virus. Of course, then we have the staffing crisis that Maxine has alluded to already. We would ask again that the Minister look at redeploying temporarily, as a matter of urgency, from across the system, qualified teachers. There are plenty, we believe, in the Education Authority, in SIA, in ETI and elsewhere, who could be, for a very short-term period, just used to help schools manage their way through this very difficult crisis. And we would just like a messaging to come from the department, again, that in our schools, it is very far from business as usual. And all of the arm's length bodies who have involvement with schools need to be aware that it is not business as usual. Our schools are still in a crisis. So I'll just leave my part there for now.
Is Marie O'Shea with us? I know she'd said she potentially had difficulties getting on.
She was on the call and she has dropped just now.
Dropped out.
So we're trying to get her
Alison,
back again.
can you pick up? You're dealing in the same area. Thank you.
Thank you. No, Marie and I are both small school principals. We've both been seconded out for a year. We're very well aware of what is going on in our schools. There are cases in our staff and their children. I've just had a teacher who's had to take her own child to hospital with COVID, and the children in our classrooms. And it is a very scary world. Principals are on their knees trying to manage all this. As Graham said, we need communication to come to us, reminders about mitigations, all that good practice that needs to be constantly reinforced. And there are mixed messages out there, about who has a close contact. If a classroom assistant is positive and been working in your room, then the teacher's a close contact, so needs tested day 2, day 8, all those things that have just become very, very mixed. And we need constant reminders about things like that. Messages have been lost. And that's really what I would like to say at this stage.
Alastair, do you want to give your evidence there now?
Thanks, Maxine, and thanks, Chair and Committee. The PHA continue to argue that schools continue to be safe environments and have a wide range of mitigations in place designed to minimise transition, which makes our schools safe for children and staff. The concern that we have is that those mitigations are not being fully adhered to. The risk assessment process that we engaged with the department in designing the initial risk assessments when schools started to reopen, they haven't been revised since September, if they have been done in September. So we're not convinced that the risk assessments, number one, have been adequately carried out, and number two, have been kept under review. As Maxine and others have said, the environment in schools has changed a number of times, but none of the risk assessments have been revised to take that into account. One specific area that I do want to address is ventilation. Ventilation is one of the key mitigations, not just in schools, but across society. And part of the issue of ventilation is the CO2 monitors. The Department of Education recently advised that around 50 schools had asked for carbon dioxide monitors. Then the Education Authority advised us that 400 monitors have been requested out of an initial supply of 1,100. There's then a further supply of 10,000 monitors on their way or already delivered, and the department were to look at allocating them to schools rather than waiting to be requested. But that's not the picture that is being shared with us from our members directly on the ground. One particular example I want to just give you, and this is from the Senko in a fairly big school. They said, I teach P7 and I have 16 positive cases out of 28 children. My SEN classroom assistant has tested positive. This really spiraled out of control over the weekend. The principal spent most of the weekend trying to get guidance from EA and PHA, which was not forthcoming. They eventually directed us to the PHA advice. The teacher herself was not contacted as a potential close contact, but common sense told her to take a PCR test, which she has done and is negative for now. Some of the other children then came into school on the Monday and have now tested positive. Whenever the school contacted the PHA, the first question PHA asked is if you have a carbon monoxide monitor installed. The principal has emailed EA regarding this some time ago, a number of weeks ago, whenever the media had said that the monitors were available but not being requested. The principal received no reply. He emailed again at the weekend, no reply. Copied in a further email, and he copied in the PHA doctor and a senior EA official, and eventually got a response which basically implied that EA are figuring out a distribution strategy. So that's contradictory to what we're being told by the Education Authority. There should be a proper plan to ensure that these monitors are placed in schools, and that a strategy is put in place to make sure that when they get to schools, schools know what to do with them. There is absolutely nothing on the DE or the Education Authority's website on how to best use the carbon monoxide monitors to make sure that ventilation is adequate. There is nothing in place to advise schools on where those monitors should be placed and what to do if they find the air quality is poor. So as Maxine said, I think we have come to the stage where generic guidance from the department and then giving schools the autonomy to do whatever they want to do, we've gone past that, and I think we need to have clear instruction to schools on what to do and how to ensure that all of the mitigations, including ventilation and the proper use of the CO2 monitors, is actually adhered to through the risk assessment process, and that risk assessment process, as legislation sets out, should be done in partnership with staff and their trade union representatives and kept under regular review. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Chair. Unless Marie is in, that's our evidence for today.
Clark, is Marie on the line? No, not yet.
She joined the call and then she dropped off again. She must have a poor signal, Chair.
Okay. Thanks, Clark. And thanks to all our witnesses for your opening comments. Some really clear messages there in terms of mitigations, particularly around mass gatherings and the importance of air quality. And indeed the concerning rate of transmissions. Could I ask in terms of air quality? Obviously, Wales put a £6 million air quality fund in place early in the summer, is my recollection. The Education Minister here didn't make such a bid until October, and we are getting concerning reports of just how slow and uncoordinated the rollout of air quality devices such as CO2 monitors and air filtration devices has been. Obviously, CO2 monitors alert you to the quality of air in your school and classrooms, but are air filtration devices not also just as important to improve the quality of that air if indeed you are alerted to concerning levels?
Alastair, are you happy enough to take that one?
Yes, Chair, and that's a fair point. I think that the CO2 monitors and how to use them is just one of a range of ways of addressing ventilation, so that's a fair point. But I think the point that we were trying to make or get across is that the system is slow in obtaining the CO2 monitors and slow in delivering them, and there's little or no guidance or advice on what to do with those. There's some generic advice in the DE guidance around opening windows when you can, or open them at a high level rather than a low level to avoid drafts. But in many classrooms, that facility isn't available. Some of the windows don't actually open. The risk assessment should also highlight that where there are air management systems in place, that they should be monitored and updated and factored into the risk assessment. We're not convinced that they are. The guidance also says to open the windows to let air through, and obviously when it's cold weather or windy weather, that causes some issues, and that to compensate for that, the heating system should be turned high to address the temperature in the room. Again, we suspect that many schools are reluctant to do that because of the additional costs that would incur in their heating bill. But I think that the issue of the CO2 monitors is one of a range of issues. If they were addressed adequately in the risk assessments and kept under review, all of those mitigations would be addressed. One other point, if I may just highlight, we've already made the point, and Maxine has referenced mass gatherings in schools, and I think that we also need to highlight the need to make sure that there's a restriction on visitors or unnecessary visitors into schools from whatever reason, but that it's not business as usual, and the schools shouldn't be allowing visitors in that are not essential.
Okay, and is there clear guidance from the Department of Education in relation to the types of mass gatherings that are causing concern?
Chair, essentially they have to follow the same for other indoor gatherings, indoor facilities, so it's still the same as what it is for the hospitality, but that's concerning because ultimately these children, there's lots now, if you remember back to last year, the mitigations were around bubbles and being able to try and restrain and restrict the amount of exposure and crossover between the bubbles, whereas now they're simply following the normal indoor social gathering rules that are generally in place. But we believe that that's not sufficient in school with the level of infection that there is in the schools. And I suppose the other issue we have with this is that particularly our members are exposed to that. It's not a choice they are making to enter into a large gathering, and nor indeed are the pupils. And I think that's the problem. If we choose to go to an indoor event, we make that choice ourselves, whereas in schools, and I think the difficulty we have is with the high levels of infection rate there are. We've had 1,200 teachers out over, in both in the last 2 weeks of the figures coming out on a Thursday. So which means we've had another 600 teachers essentially infected in that previous week. 600 have dropped off and 600 have been infected. And the levels, we know that our schools are crying out for subs. We know that our children essentially are being put together to be supervised, and we're not convinced that that's actually good for them, for their education. And equally, we want to try and keep the schools open, which I think now, if nothing else, we need to have some sort of emergency measures put in place to stop the spread within the schools that we know is happening at the minute.
Okay, before I bring other members in, just wanted to ask one other question. Receiving some concerns that the staff shortage may be leading in some instances to non-subject specific teachers teaching specific subjects, particularly for key exam years, is due to a lack of contingency plan in place from the department to mitigate those staff shortages. Is that something that you're observing?
Graham, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, well, absolutely. That's something we're observing. The staff shortages are affecting all schools in terms of
Graham, let me pause you for a second there. Could I ask anyone who isn't speaking just to go on to mute to ensure that the sound quality is best as possible? Thanks, Graham.
There seem to be a lot of post-primary schools who are struggling to get subject specialist teachers in the middle of the staffing crisis. We have been asking the Minister and the Department for quite some time to consider how they're going to mitigate for children in examination years, as I believe they have done on the other side of the Irish Sea. As yet, though, there haven't been any such mitigations here. Chris, if I could just also add, a couple of moments ago, you were talking about the mass gatherings. The minister and the department will say, why do schools just not make these decisions themselves? Why should the department make a sort of decree for all schools? Well, Maxine earlier on alluded to the fact that many schools are in contexts where they're having to compete for numbers. They're also struggling with all sorts of community pressures and so on. And rather than pitting school leaders who are trying to, in many cases, make decisions that are safe in terms of COVID transmission, is pitting them against their communities. And it's just not a fair situation. Would be much more helpful if the Minister's office could demonstrate some leadership in this. And if I could also just say, Chris, you mentioned earlier, you were talking about CO2 monitors and ventilation. When that story hit the media a number of weeks ago, we in NIHT had a huge amount of correspondence from members who said that the media coverage was misleading in saying that many school leaders hadn't been requesting monitors. Many of our members got back in touch and said they had been requesting monitors. Their calls and emails hadn't been answered or responded to. And when they had been answered or responded to, they were deflected in many cases. So again, just important to get through to the truth. That might not be what you get from other bodies. That's what our members are reporting to us.
Thanks for that, Graham. Can I bring in then the Deputy Chairperson, Pat Sheehan, MLA? Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. And just then on the issue of air quality at the minute, have any of the HEPA air filtration systems been made available to any schools? Do any of you know that? Thanks.
I can answer that again if it's okay. I know that the EA do have a huge amount of monitors ready to go. They have guidance that they've been writing that's ready to go. And they have, I believe they're in the process of purchasing filtration units, the HEPA filtration units. However, they're not going to be distributed to every school. My understanding is that monitors will come out to every school, and where there's a problem that can't be mitigated by opening windows. So if there's a room without good ventilation, those units will then be provided. So at the moment, though, there isn't a plan to put HEPA filtration units into every school.
Okay, thanks for that, Graham. Moving on to another issue. Justin McCanfill was in the media last week, I think it was, and suggested that schools should close on the 15th. That irrespective of whether they close or not, many parents are going to keep their children off school so as to avoid them contracting COVID in the run-up to Christmas and having to isolate over the Christmas period. Yesterday in the chamber, the minister effectively ruled that out. Do any of you want to comment on that? Thanks.
Yes, thanks. One of the reasons why we're here and why we're trying to put in place, we want just to put stronger mitigations in from the department, is in order to prevent that, because families still want to have their Christmas and they don't want it disturbed by COVID. And if we continue on the way we have been with the amount of infections within schools here in Northern Ireland, then people's Christmases are going to be affected by the level of infection. When you think about that, there's going to be a number of mass gatherings. One of the other points around mass gatherings, if I now go to a hospitality, I have to show my COVID passport in order to attend that indoor gathering in hospitality. So I think the difference is in schools that we need to try and put a stop now on the level of infection, considering we're now on the 7th of December. We need to try and slow it down or stop it. But if we continue the way we have been, we're going to have the same levels of infection week in and week out.
Anyone else want to come in on that point?
Pat, yeah, I would just say that, again, we would just ask the Minister to liaise again with PHA and look at the guidance around contact tracing, who is considered to be close contacts, and the isolation guidance. These are factors that are contributing directly to the spread of transmission in our schools.
Okay, thanks. And it's coming across clearly in your presentations that there's a great sense of frustration among schools about the situation and the lack of proactivity on the part of the department and the education authority. Would that be a fair reading of your position at the minute? Thanks.
I'll come in again, and then I promise I'll be quiet for a while. We received a good example of this, Pat, is the circular that went out to schools yesterday on remote learning. Trade unions received that on Friday afternoon for consultation to be back at 9 a.m. on Monday morning. I don't know about my colleagues here, but I know that the contributions I made were roundly ignored. I mean, for example, I wanted it to be made clear in the circular that if a teacher is sick because of COVID and substitute teachers aren't available, it's then impossible, surely, for remote learning to be provided in a short-term basis because the teacher is unwell and no other staff was available. That's the reason why a short-term measure of closing a class or whatever it might be had to take place. I just wanted that to be put into the circular to, again, manage realistic expectations. That was ignored. I put in another comment about can we advise school leaders on what is a reasonable expectation about how long or how much effort you should put into trying to get a substitute teacher, with many of our members telling us they're making upwards of 100 phone calls, still to no avail, taking all of their Friday evenings, Saturdays, Sundays and evenings trying to get substitute teachers without success. So I was asking the department, can they put a reasonable expectation on what school leaders should be expected to do before they make a decision that they might have to close for a cohort of children for a short period of time? That was ignored as well. I don't know if any of my colleagues from other unions contributed to that or saw any changes made in that document, but that's the level of consultation that we're used to, Pat, and it is very frustrating indeed.
Alastair, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, can I just add to that sense of frustration? I think that we mentioned earlier about if you can't find a specialist substitute to cover a specialist area. That's not what we're hearing on the ground. Schools are reluctant to send pupils home because of the backlash from parents and the media. That the best place for them should be in their school. So what's actually happening is that year groups and classes are being lumped together in assembly halls, and they're being supervised by one or two teachers and one or two classroom assistants, whilst, as Graham says, the principals may be phoning around trying to find substitute cover. There is an issue around non-teaching staff being asked to either supervise or indeed engage in the teaching of pupils, but we're picking up quite a few instances where children and pupils are just being looked after or supervised rather than properly taught. That then has an add-on impact on the teachers who are still in the school, that their workloads are exceeding all agreed directed time, and the amount of cover that they're being asked to do, the amount of supervision that they're being asked to do. And again, in a perverse way, putting 3 or 4 year groups into the one area, instead of being a class with the appropriate mitigations, that then becomes a mass gathering or an incubator. So there's risks associated with that. There is no reference in any risk assessment that I've seen on how you supervise multiple classes or multiple year groups for periods of time. There's also a lack of clarity around what is a short period of time. For us, if you come into school first thing in the morning and there are 2 teachers phone in sick, then first lesson or second lesson, it's appropriate for some supervision to take place then to allow something to be put in place. But what we're hearing is that supervision is lasting the entire day, and the driver for that is purely the school are reluctant to send pupils home. Where the school do have to send pupils home as well, and it touches on Graham's point about the remote learning and what is a reasonable expectation. There is still an unreasonable expectation from from parents that where small groups or individual pupils are either isolating or identified as a close contact, that they should be taught remotely by the same teacher who's teaching live in school the rest of the class who aren't there. And that's just not feasible. So again, as Graham says, there needs to be more done by the department and the PHA on managing the expectations of parents about what can actually be done in schools.
Okay, Pat.
Thanks, Alastair. Thank you, Chair. Thanks.
Chairman, Stephen Murray here from ASCL.
Yeah, Stephen, I was just about to bring you in there before I go to other members. I'm delighted that our chair of ASCL, Stephen Moore, and I think Graham Montgomery as well have been able to join us on the call. Stephen, would you like to make any brief comments, and then I'll bring other members in for questions as well?
Yeah, sure. First of all, apologies, I had difficulty logging on. I know that I think it's difficult for us to get on from the C2K system onto Starleaf, so maybe that's something that could be looked at for future reference as well, because we're in schools at the moment. So no I think one of the things that we would be saying, having talked to our members as well, we recognise that there's a problem. We recognise there's a problem with substitute teachers and the availability of substitute teachers. I suppose that we don't understand quite where that's come from. But there could be some unintended consequences from other measures that have been put in place as well. So that is difficult for people. And we know of school leaders who are doing substitute cover and teaching. And I agree with what Graham Gault said earlier as well, that it is time to look at maybe reallocating people from qualified teachers who are working outside the classroom and having a look to see if we can bring people in there. I think our position is that closing schools must be avoided at all costs. And I think that's a really important point. The first thing is that we're starting to see the consequences of the two closures that we had over the last 2 years. And I think it's had a really detrimental impact on our young people. And I think that really needs to be the focus that the Education Committee takes, what is best for young people. We have seen lots of mental health issues, pupils who were struggling before the pandemic and before the closures are in a worse position now, but other people are struggling too. And I think that what school brings to people is not only education and lessons, but also structures, networks, support, enrichment activities, and all sorts of other things that they need and require. So we really need to look imaginatively at solutions which keep pupils in school and which make sure that their education isn't disrupted. I think we don't want to close schools, and I think in terms of what was being said about remote learning as well, remote learning is very much second best. It's not the same as face-to-face teaching. I think it's good that we can have some flexibility in terms of bringing in remote learning where that helps schools manage a particularly difficult situation. I think the other thing to say is that what we're hearing today is a picture that's happening in some schools, but it's not universal. So I do think there needs to be a situation where we're looking at individual situations or individual solutions for individual schools, because they all present with different problems. Some schools aren't having a problem at the moment, and I think we need to recognise that as well. I don't know if Graham wants to come in there as well, or whether you want to go to other witnesses.
I'll just add to that, Stephen. I think we're all on the same page.
Sorry, Graham, apologies. I think Stephen may have been referring to Graham Montgomery.
Sorry, Graham.
No problem.
Very happy to hear from Graham Gault as well, though.
No problem. Can I bring in Graham Montgomery? Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. Graham and I are very fortunate to have the same name, and we just have to live with that burden. Stephen Moore has fairly comprehensively covered the ASCL position on this. I think a number of things are worth reiterating, and certainly talking to our members. School does serve a lot of different purposes other than the transfer of information, and therefore we believe that it's really important to keep to facilitate young people in being in school for as much of the time as possible. And we are now, as Stephen has said, seeing the outworking of damage that has been done to young people, which may be longer lasting and more profound than the danger presented to them immediately by being in school. I think it's also really important that schools are given the flexibility to manage this situation in a way which reflects the local need. And in talking to our members, there is no universal picture. We need to be very careful then about addressing it on a universal solution. I think school leaders have agency and professional autonomy and should be respected to be able to manage their schools in a way which is consistent with the needs of the local community. So rural schools, for example, may have very different needs at this time than large urban schools. I think the restrictions that are in place, the guidance that is already in place in schools is clear about mixing of year groups, for example, that is not at all advised, and that if they're being brought together in a larger scale, that the usual mitigation should be in place for that. So I think there are lots of things that are already there, and school leaders need to be trusted to follow some of these things. Remote learning, as has already been mentioned, is absolutely suboptimal and is not to be regarded as an alternative to classroom practice. And I think the guidance that came from DE yesterday goes some way. And I take Graham Gault's point that there may have been some things put in that document which might have been more helpful. But I think that it goes some way to clarifying the situation for many of us. And the point that I think has already been made by a number of people, and I'll just reiterate it because I think it's a really important point, there's clearly a supply problem as far as having qualified substitute teachers in the classroom. And there are a significant number of qualified teachers who are currently in non-pupil facing roles. And if we take the urgency of the situation we're in now, which is to have these people in front of pupils in classrooms, to enable schools to stay open, to enable all of the many things that schools do to continue, then some of those people, many of those people, whether it's in the EA or ETI or many of those other bodies, could be, if there was a will to match the need, could be redeployed into pupil-facing roles in school, which would enable us to get through this very difficult period. And I think that would certainly be welcomed in school, because head teachers and vice principals who have responsibility for this sort of thing are spending a huge amount of time trying to source substitute teachers in order to at least have someone in front of a room giving a young person some sort of meaningful experience. But I think all the other points have largely been made, and thank you very much for hearing me.
Thanks for that, Graham, and for Stephen. I think it is important that we do try to funnel in towards actions here, and hopefully maybe even identify some consensus. But I'm hearing guidance around mass gatherings, urgent action on ventilation, and urgent assistance with substitute cover. Keen to bring in other members at this point as well. Robin Newton, MLA, with us.
Sorry, Chair. Can I apologise? I had great difficulty logging on this morning. Probably 4 or 5 attempts to get on.
No problem. Good to have you with us now, Robin. Thanks.
Well, the only presentation, the comments, I heard the end of Mr. Stephen Moore's and indeed Mr. Graham Montgomery's comments. So I have to say I was greatly encouraged by what both gentlemen said this morning, because I was under the impression from newspaper media reports that indeed the teaching unions were generally calling for a blanket closure of schools from mid-December, and obviously for all the reasons that have been made by Mr. Moore and Mr. Montgomery in terms of the health of our children, mental health of our children, physical health of our children, and indeed all the things that schools do on a normal basis in terms of teaching and so on. I felt, and they themselves have recognised that the best place for children is indeed in school. So I'm encouraged by what Stephen Moore and Graham Montgomery have said this morning. Sir, maybe if if you would allow me to come back at a later stage, I may have more questions than that.
Happy to do that, Robin, and appreciate it wasn't possible to connect earlier, but I don't think any of the unions presenting this morning have called for a blanket closure of schools. Indeed, there's been some very detailed contributions in terms of guidance on mass gatherings, urgent need for ventilation, and urgent assistance with substitute cover, and yes, some reality and guidance in terms of what needs to happen if that substitute cover is not in place in terms of class closures. I think the term was used, but I don't think anyone has referred to blanket closure of schools. But indeed, happy to bring you back in, Robin, as the discussion progresses. Thanks for that.
Sorry, I did say that I was reacting to what had been covered in the press and quotes in the press.
Understand.
We do know that headlines can indeed paint a picture that you really do need to read down into the detail. But I am pleased with what Mr. Moore and Mr. Montgomery said this morning. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Thanks, Robin. Can I bring in Nicola Brogan, MLA, please? Thanks.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks everyone. Great to see you all here this morning. It's clear that you're all facing huge challenges, and I've spoken to many principals in my area as well, and teachers and that, so I know that there are real struggles in schools at the moment. But Stephen and Graham, just back to your point there about treating schools almost individually, I think that's really important actually, because I spoke to a principal in my area last week who says they're actually doing really well and managing the situation really well. I think more so because of how she's working with parents within the school, and her own kind of mitigation she's putting in place, and like managing staff and that there. So I do think that's an important point to make, that some schools are managing really well with it, but it's clear that others are really struggling. So Graham, Gault, back to your point about redeploying staff from the likes of the EA and ETI, or redeploying teachers back into the classroom. How practical do you think that is in regards to the likes of like CPD years and like the qualification still being up to date, whatever, and even like the likes of, I can't remember what it's called in teaching, but the equivalents like access NI checks. Is it practicable?
Yeah, it's practical, Nicola, and if I had a list of those people, I'm sure over the weekend I'd be able to deploy them myself to schools. I don't see it as being a particularly heavy or onerous task. There might not be a willingness from some people in other parts of the system to come into schools. And listen, I imagine that a lot of the problems are sectoral as well, because some of our larger schools may have the scope within their staff, within their existing staffing complement, to offset some of the staffing crisis, but many schools just don't. And I'm thinking in particular of nursery and primary schools, where there is no elasticity in terms of staffing. Principals are on the whole, already covering basic supervisory tasks and so on. But from across the system, I don't see any great problem. I don't know if the department has looked at it or not. You would think maybe 20 months into the crisis, somebody would have, but I don't imagine it to be a particularly difficult task. Qualifications are still relevant.
Yeah, well, as it was said in the media last week, I think, as well, about it happened within the health service at the outbreak of COVID, how staff were redeployed there, where we're kind of needed in the front line. So maybe that is a good solution. The other point I want to ask about, hasn't been talked about this morning so far, is about children with special educational needs in special schools. Has there been any particular challenges for them? I know previously there has been with regards staff as well, but any particular challenges facing those schools that you are aware of?
Colleagues, if I can just pick up on that one, Nicola, I think that certainly the staff shortage has been a big issue for our special schools, and there has been individual classes have had to be closed because they don't have the number of staff that they need, and that's both teaching and support staff, because as you know, in our special schools there's a big need for support staff and classroom assistants. And there has been, so a number of schools we have received certainly from members, there's been classes closed in those schools due to the level of infection of the teachers within the schools. And the other aspect of it is there has been a number of quite serious injuries, both of staff or of students in some of our special schools. And that's primarily down to the fact that there hasn't been the correct staff-pupil ratio within the classroom. So it's a very difficult situation for those children, particularly where they are our most vulnerable and where those families need the most support. But I know our special schools are struggling. Even prior to the latest increase in infection rates, our special schools have been struggling to get the levels of staff that they require.
Thanks for that, Maxine. Just on that point, I know with the second kind of lockdown, we made a point of keeping special schools open because we all know how important that is for the children that attend and for their families and that. So what kind of solutions would you bring to the table to think that they could help staff of special schools so they don't have to send children home or close down particular classrooms?
I think one of the things the Education Authority have been looking at, not only even prior to the COVID, was having a bank of trained classroom assistants who would then be able to fill in and move into classrooms and into schools where they're needed. Our difficulty is that it hasn't been up and running prior to COVID, and with this current staff shortages that we have, then it's just not. It hasn't happened, Nicola, is the answer, but I think that would be the answer going forward, and I know that's something the Education Authority are looking at, but we just haven't been able to move on it. And I think the other issue we have is that school principals at times are reluctant to train staff because they don't know how long they're going to stay for. And there does seem to be, and also how they're hired. I think we would need to nearly do a mass recruitment exercise, although to be fair to the Education Authority, I have seen quite if you look on their jobs adverts, the classroom assistant and SEN is generally up there. They're looking for staff. But I don't think that then comes down to why are we not attracting people to that as a career, and that becomes an even a different question.
Yeah, a whole different conversation, yeah. But maybe resources and training out there is a good enough place to start. Thanks for that, Maxine. That's everything, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicola. Can I bring in Justin McNulty, MLA, please?
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, folks. Hope you're all well. Hope you're all enjoying the wildness of Storm Barra, which is spectacularly dangerous for driving editions, especially. I'm not driving as we speak, by the way. Folks, listen, thank you for everything you've done so far in this pandemic. And my first question is, how are you? How are you all doing? How is morale within your members? How are you keeping putting one foot in front of the other? Given we thought we were coming out the tail end of this pandemic a couple of months back, we thought we were coming through it, we were out the other end, and it's now very evident we're not. I heard that some of the experts describing it as being 1941, 1942 in World War II. How are your members, guys? How are you keeping?
Alison, do you want to come in on that one?
Yes, well, indeed, it's lovely of you to ask. Well, I know that myself and my colleagues were just weary at this moment in time because we have been trying our best to keep our schools safe, and there's just an uneasiness at the minute. I suppose that everybody's in the same boat. I think that the scientists think it'll be another week before we really know what this new variant is going to do, but it's just all the uncertainty. But we just back to that communication. We would just love communications coming from the department, just to keep us all in the same hymn sheet, the same track, really. Is Mary, are you able to speak at the minute, Mary? Because I think Mary has got in there and she would have more to say as well.
Hello, yes, thanks, Alison. I appreciate the opportunity. Storm Barra has hit West Fermanagh quite strongly, and I have difficulties getting in all morning to the conversation. But absolutely, Alison's correct. Staff are weary, staff are tired. I've never spoken to as many principals who feel their backs are against the wall. They
Gone again.
I think we've lost her again there, Alison. If you want to come back in, if we get her back, we'll bring her back in, and then I'll bring others in as well.
Yeah, so any of my colleagues and anybody who are ringing in here, they're tearful, they're emotional. Principals are trying to support the school and keep every area of the school running. I mean, there's days there's no cleaners, crossing patrol people. It's just the whole thing. But it's the nature within us to just keep things going and keep going. But all of a sudden, I think principals are going to break a little bit, because there's only so much we can do as well. Graham, what about the principals that are in touch with you?
Which Graham?
We'll go Graham Gault, and then I'll bring Stephen and Graham in if they want to come in as well, and then go back to Justin.
Well, I remember the last time we were at the committee, Justin asked this question and almost reduced me to tears, because very rarely do people ask anybody in trade unions, how they're feeling or how their members are, but really appreciate it. So school leaders are, I'm sure it's the same with school leaders in all of the trade unions, just really struggling. And it's important to point out that we went into the COVID context already really struggling with issues of workload. NITC have been in an industrial dispute with the department over workload. Those problems have, of course, just intensified many times throughout the course of this. And I fear, in all seriousness, for recruitment and retention of people in school leadership going on into the future. It's a wonderful job. It can bring a huge amount of satisfaction. But when young folk are looking at our school leaders at the moment, the terms under which they're working, including the fact that there are totally open-ended contracts within the Jordanstown Agreement, which means anything can be asked of someone in school leadership. There's no safe cap on working hours or anything like that. Why would you do it? So I think, as we come out of this on the other side, there needs to be some serious thought about the well-being of people in school leadership. But everyone in our schools are struggling at the moment, from all of the support staff right through the teaching staff. Everybody's really finding things very difficult.
Thanks, Graham. Can I bring in Graham Montgomery or Stephen Moore before I go back to Justin?
Yeah, I'll respond to that, Chairman. Thank you very much, first of all, for asking. I think Graham Gault's point is quite right. It is nice to be asked, and it's not only that people don't often ask trade unionists how they are. I think when you're in headship in a school, people just don't ask you how you are, full stop. Your parents don't ask, staff don't tend to ask, and pupils. And it's always lovely when a pupil does say, how are you, sir, whenever you ask them how they are. So it creates a very good feeling, and I think that's really important. And I mean, morale is probably on a bit of a roller coaster, I would say, in terms of the reality in school. I've never seen staff more positive than they were at the start of the year when we all came back and we were engaging with pupils and extracurricular activities were going again, and we were beginning to see pupils flourish. That's why we do this job. And Graham Gault quite rightly says, why would anyone do it? We accept that there are long hours. We accept that we have impossible demands placed upon us by a range of stakeholders who think we can deliver everything that they want. And therefore, at times, for those of us in leadership, it can be very difficult. But generally, there was a very positive attitude at the start of the year, because we were trying our best to give pupils a more normal school experience. And that's what we're continuing to try and do. And that now, ironically, is what's creating the stress for many of us. And I think the difference between the increase in COVID now and this time last year is there is much more normality in school in terms of what we're doing. Sporting activities are continuing, extracurricular activities are continuing. And so we're trying to deliver all of those soft elements which make school memorable for pupils, and at the same time try and mitigate against the spread of infection in school. We're trying to keep we have to remember that our staff have families and they have young children. So it's not just the spread of infection within school. It's the spread of infection within community, which impacts on staff who then have to go off to isolate or to test. So we have this constant toing and froing, which is what makes it difficult in school. But in talking to our members, what I find, and I'm sure colleagues in other unions will feel the same, a deep commitment to keep going. And that's why some of the chat in the media, which has been referred to, which almost suggests that we're trying to close the schools, is is demoralising for us, because that's not at all what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is keep schools open and to do everything that we can to keep schools open. But we'll get there, and we'll get there with the support of our wider communities, which is why we think it's so important that schools have the flexibility and leaders have the professional autonomy to be able to get through this in a way which is most responsive to the needs of their community, whatever the sector, whatever the phase, and whatever the area. So thanks for the question.
Thanks, Graham. Justin?
Thanks for the answers, folks. Thank you. Right, your determination, your resilience, your sense of humility, your compassion, that reflects on your school bodies and on the school environments, and that reflects on the kids and how they perceive this whole pandemic, which is about much more in education. Numbers and words and detail. It's about educating them as people in terms of dealing with the storms in life, and there are storms in life, and that, I think, the way you are handling this, that's a hugely important example to children and young people. So well done. In terms of mitigations and contact tracing, those are two issues I wanted just you to touch on, please, in terms of where you see the mitigations. The Education Minister talks about the mitigations. Are those mitigations enough? And the contact tracing, is it creating a sense of fear within school communities and within parent groups and within pupil bodies? Give me your perspective on those two issues, folks, please.
I think, Justin, one of the key issues, which is why we were welcomed being able to speak with you today, and with the level of infections, we are concerned that the mitigations and the contact tracing that's in place is not curtailing the spread of the virus within our schools. When you look at the numbers that we've had over the last, certainly the last 2 weeks, that it hasn't went below, it's been close to 1,200 for even in the school staff. So it's clearly shown that the mitigations are not working at the moment. And the contact tracing, as we've said there, you spend potentially 6 hours a day sitting beside the same person who then becomes positive, and you're not a close contact. So, it is certainly, the PHA indicated last Thursday meeting to us that if people, they do need to do that testing at day 2 and then day 8. But what they're finding is that those who are becoming positive in and around day 5. And if they haven't become positive, then they more than likely won't. So the issue there is the mitigations, and these, which we're trying to emphasise upon you and the executive, that we need to have stronger mitigations in place for a period of time. We're not saying they're going to be in forever, but at the minute we're on essentially the mouth of Christmas. We all believe that schools are the best place for our children. Nobody anywhere is having a dispute over that. But what we need to do is we need to try and curtail the level of spread, and what we're doing at the minute isn't doing that, whether it be the contact tracing or the mitigations. And my concern is, although there is some who will be making in our view, the right decisions, but we're also looking, as we've said earlier, Justin, where schools are in competition with one another for pupils, and we know the pupils then mean whether a school is viable or not. So that is going to encourage schools where they are vulnerable to carry out the like of these open days and open nights and P7 trial days that are going to bring even more people into the mix, and having them mix, and even if we try and keep them apart, we're having activities within the schools. So that's where our concern is. I think it's pretty obvious, and we all do, that the mitigations and the current contact tracing is not working when we look at the levels of infection.
Yeah, listen,
anybody else wants to come in there?
Chairman, could I maybe come in there?
Yeah, so I think Alastair wishes to come in. I'm happy to bring you back, Justin, after that.
Just very briefly, and again, thank you, Justin, for your question about how we are. I think many of us on this call and many of the DE officials and PHA officials have the luxury of more or less still working from home most of the time, so we have control over our own environments and our own interactions. Our school staff don't have the same luxury, and I think as Graham Montgomery has highlighted, there is a huge commitment out there across the education sector to try to do our best to keep pupils in school, but there's also a huge sense of frustration. Just one example that I would like to share with you. I had an email from a member last night. Frustration that the PHA continued to say that schools are safe, and if anybody contracts COVID, particularly an adult working in school, it is more than likely that they caught it in the community rather than in the school, because, and then they peddle the myth, schools are safe. But the teacher that emailed me last night said they have tested positive for COVID, and they're sure that it was in school. In the course of the day, there are times at the start and end of lessons where pupils come to talk to the teacher, and the rest of the class are leaving or moving about, so there's a lot of background noise, and the pupil leans in or takes the mask down to talk to the teacher, and there's an interaction there. So this particular teacher, who has been careful at home, careful in society, careful in the shops, and taken all of the mitigations in place, has contracted COVID, probably from that interaction with the pupil. And one specific question that they have asked is, why are there not plastic screens at the side of a teacher's desk for those interactions? If you go to a shop or any other part of society, there are plastic screens everywhere, but in schools there aren't. And this particular teacher believes that they have contracted COVID specifically from an interaction in school. So I think that's another example of why our members are contacting us to say that there's a level of frustration that the people who are making the guidance, the people who are making the rules, aren't actually on the ground in schools with no practical understanding of the reality in schools.
Chairman, could I maybe just come in there from another thing, just a point about contact tracing. I think that obviously the situation we had with contact tracing at the beginning of the year wasn't good. It was unacceptable that schools were being asked to do contact tracing on behalf of the PHA, and I think that the changes that came into place after that were to be welcomed. I think another thing that we need to bear in mind is that we don't want healthy children at home learning from home and having disruption to their learning in that way. So we want to do everything we can to try and keep those children in school. I do appreciate the problem, and maybe picking up on what Alastair was saying there as well, we maybe need to revisit some of those measures that we're taking to make sure that the interactions are kept to a minimum and that people are staying away from teachers' desks and so on. I think to go back to what Graham Gault was saying earlier as well, is that there are large sectoral differences, so that maybe we need different measures in primary schools or in special schools where there's likely to be more interaction between pupils or close contact between pupils and teachers, and then post-primary schools where I think it is easier, I'm not saying it's easy, but easier to put measures in place which can protect staff. So that's something that can be looked at. We talked about open days and open mornings. My understanding is that we've already had guidance from the department as well, which has recommended that we do those online this year, and I think that most schools are going to be doing that, avoiding bringing people in from the community. I suppose we do we mirror what happens in the community as well. There is obviously transmission that's taking place in schools, and perhaps that is more the case in primary schools and in post-primary schools, but we are kind of subject to what's happening in wider society. So if infections are on the rise in society, then we're dealing with that community transmission in schools as well, and we have to try and cope with that. I think it was very useful earlier in the year when we had the decision from the PHA to take on contact tracing, that they were able to produce figures for us. So they were able to show that studies had shown that in England and Scotland, it was around 95 to 98% of people who had been asked to do COVID tests had not gone on to contract COVID. Now, I know that information is now out of date, but it is very useful for schools to have information from the PHA about the mitigations that are in place and about whatever strategies they're putting in place, because that helps us understand, it helps us communicate things to pupils, it helps us to provide a rationale to staff, and it helps us also in our communications with parents. So I think the more information we have and the more detailed information we have about these things, the better. I think we need to be cautious about the steps that we take to make sure that they're the right steps. It's easy to do something, but we need to do the right thing rather than just doing anything at all to deal with a difficult situation. I know that you asked about kind of welfare of staff as well. I think that will vary from school to school depending on how the school has been impacted by COVID. And I think by and large, a lot of people are bearing up well. And I think it's what Graham said as well, that people are bearing up because they have that sense of moral purpose. They want to be in schools. They want to be providing for pupils. And they have the pupils' best interests at heart.
Okay. Thanks for that, Stephen. Can I bring Justin back in?
Just very briefly, I don't want to hog all the time. So I was in 3 schools last week, and I was overwhelmed by the sense of normality that was there, given where we are with the pandemic, and the esprit de corps amongst teachers, staff and pupils. It was just wonderful to see. So listen, thanks again, folks. Keep going. That sense of purpose that you all have is phenomenally important, and that's why people get into teaching, because they want to make a difference and improve children's lives, and that's what you're doing so fantastically well. So keep going. Thank you very much, folks.
Thanks, Justin. In terms of guidance around open days and mass gatherings, then if the department's guidance is that they should be taking place online, does that mean that there are schools operating out with that guidance then, or planning to? Maxine, you raised that originally, yeah?
Yes, Chair, it clearly does, because they're planning on they're treating this, I suppose, as a P7 yesterday, as opposed to an open evening where their parents would bring them, so the children will be coming from their primary schools. But in effect, it's still the same type of event.
Okay, noted. Can I bring in Harry Harvey, MLA, please? Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Clark. I suppose as Robin and most people invest in...
Harry, sorry to pause you. I want to make sure we can hear you properly. So anyone who isn't speaking, mute their device, please. Thanks. Thanks, Harry.
No problem, Chair. It's not going to be that good, so I wouldn't have worried. But anyway, we'll have a go. No, I think as with everyone, best and safest place for children, for many reasons, are our schools, and I must add, under their leadership of our highly esteemed principals that sometimes I think don't get enough praise. I'm content with the CO meters increased rollout and that. I suppose, for improvements, I would be thinking, what improvements from a headmaster's point of view would they personally see, short term and long term? We really need to speak to all our principals, because, as someone has said, every school has different needs. So I'd like to know, what's the best thing we can do short term, but then long term as well. What would you see going forward for a good improvement? I know a shortness of staff makes all things different, but even small things sometimes make a great difference. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Harry. Yeah, Graham, go ahead.
Chancellor, thank you. Thanks, Harry. All of the people in our schools, school leaders are carrying a huge burden at the moment, but all of the workers in our schools are performing miracles just at the moment to keep our schools open. In short term, school leaders would like support in terms of staffing their schools, and that's there are many schools which are just really struggling to keep the doors open. We would need more consistent guidance from the Department of Education with greater timescales and authentic consultation where they actually do listen, and that would be most welcome. And in terms of the conversation we're having about mass gatherings, just I believe that the department should make it clear.
Graham, sorry to pause you. Could I just reiterate, anyone that isn't speaking, try to mute their device, please, to avoid background noise. There we go. Thanks, Graham.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the Department of Education should make it clear exactly. Yes, they've given us guidance, and I'm all for autonomy of school principals, but in this health context, and where principals are under great pressure in some communities, in terms of both community expectation and competition between schools, I think it's really important that the Minister's office makes it very clear that mass gatherings shouldn't be happening just at the present time. Longer term, we have a number of reviews that came out of the industrial dispute for school leaders in particular. There are two. The review into accountability is very important, but also the review into school leader workload. And that has been progressing very well. I'm particularly encouraged by what I see in terms of the development of that review and the forthcoming report. What needs to happen on the other side, though, is genuine, authentic delivery. so that our principals can see practical, positive, tangible benefits. And I'm trusting that when we get the publication of that report at some point during the next year, that all of the stakeholders, most importantly the Department of Education, will be committed to delivering on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just a few comments on shortage of staff, and again mentioned that seems to be the main thing. You were saying consistent guidance is something that's needed. I would add to that it always needs to be two-way. The guidance needs to be there, but like I said, every school is different, and principals in each school need to get their needs sent in and then get them analysed. On the long term, the main thing you said is workload. Again, that's probably down to staff shortages, would you say, going forward?
There are many issues: staff shortages, funding, increased expectation over the past decade with significantly decreased resource, all sorts of issues around governance, it's a huge issue, Harry. But that workload review has been very effective in scoping out from folk from all sectors what the issues are. And I'm really looking forward to getting through to the stage of recommendations from that review.
Chairman, could I come in there?
Yeah, go ahead, Graham.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just to endorse largely what Graham has just said, so that a bit of harmony there between the NIHT and ASCL. He's hit the nail on the head with all of those things. I mean, workload is a wider issue, which probably isn't one for today. But I think if we prioritise the issues and we look at things in terms of urgency, the most urgent issue is staff in school. And there are lots and lots of different reasons why those staff aren't available. So, for example, although it's not recommended practice, it has often been accepted practice that recently retired teachers were available for subbing. And schools like that in many ways because they knew the school and there was a continuity of care there by bringing those people in. Many of those retired teachers now, because they are concerned about COVID, because they are moving into an area where they're more vulnerable, have taken themselves out of the scenario altogether. Many of the younger teachers are now and younger subs are now in so much demand that they have taken, for the first time in my experience, to emailing schools with their availability. So they're contacting us to say, I'm available on the 8th of December and the 13th of December. And that's unprecedented in my experience, but indicates just how critical the staffing situation is. Now, I would anticipate that whatever happens to schools pre-Christmas, when we have Christmas and people go and they mix as they inevitably will, and they do their shopping, and by January we will probably have more COVID in the community than we have now. And that will impact on schools, whether it's in-school transmission, which it won't be in January because schools will have been closed, or whether it's community transmission, which will be more likely. And if the staffing situation now is critical, which it is, then it will be more critical in January. And therefore, action, I think, needs to be taken now in a focused and urgent way by the department to ensure that staff availability, the busy staff are freed up to increase the supply of teaching. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing then relates to non-teaching staff. And obviously my organisation represents school leaders, but we work with people who aren't teachers at all, and they're crucial to how a school functions. You cannot have a school functioning without classroom assistants and reprographic assistants and a whole range of people in the front office. Just so crucial. Cleaning staff, the lot. And there is an issue of resourcing there. Now, I have been working with EA emergency resourcing over the last couple of weeks because we've had real problems with non-teaching staff. And I would want to just say that I'm pleased with the service that they're providing. I'm sure, like everything, it could be refined and improved. But you also have to identify good practice and praise that. And I think they have been doing something of a good job in terms of identifying people and getting information out to schools and saying, these people are available, and they've been telling us when they're available and how to contact them and what their level of qualifications are, and that's been really helpful. But the staffing issue is critical, and it needs action now, because it is likely to be more critical in January, and then we'll be back here having a more in-depth conversations, but of a more serious nature. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. Conscious of time, I think 10:30 is a reasonable aim to finish here. I think all members have asked questions. Harry, did you want to come back in on any of that?
No, that's fine. Thank you to the two Grahams for their answers. Excellent. Everything points towards staff. It just all points towards a shortness in staff, long term, short term. The difficulty, I don't know. I'm thinking myself, how do we cure that? We're all thinking that, but yep, that's great. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Harry. As I said, I think that's all. Members have had an opportunity to come in. Do either of the Northern Ireland Teaching Council or ASCL wish to make any closing comments before I sum up?
I don't think so, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, folks, thanks so much indeed for your time with us today. We realise it's an extremely challenging time at this moment in time, and always an extremely busy time of year for all of you. We say a very sincere thanks to everyone in the education community for the work that you're doing beyond the call of duty to keep our education system running at this time, and we acknowledge the extreme pressure that is on everyone involved in the system. My key takeaways today that we as a committee will endeavour to action is A, for information. We've invited the education minister to attend the education committee and respond to the issues that are being raised. I don't think we've had a positive response yet. I'm still hopeful that opportunity to respond to these issues would be taken, because for me the key issues would appear to be key action taken to reduce transmission in schools and to maximise safety in schools. And the key points that have been raised today is the need for really clear guidance and restriction on mass gathering, urgent action on CO2 and air filtration devices to improve ventilation in schools, if not some screening measures as well, and urgent, long overdue assistance with substitute teacher cover, which could take specific forms in terms of assistance with the administration of that, and indeed a need for at least short-term additional numbers of substitute teacher cover as well, with some suggestions as to how that might be possible. I think also guidance for when that cover is not possible to achieve, I think, has been mentioned as well. So we will write to the Education Minister on all those grounds and endeavour to update you as soon as possible. But I do think it would be helpful for the Education Minister to attend the committee to respond to those issues. But thanks so much for your evidence to us today. I hope you've found the engagement with us useful. I hope that my understanding of the key issues there is accurate. And as I say, we will correspond with the Education Minister on those grounds. And we continue to thank you for the work that you're doing across our schools in Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to come.
Thank you.
Okay, can I ask broadcasting to remove witnesses and add members back into the spotlight, and ask the clerk to summarise actions from the briefing. Clerk? Hopefully I've given you a head start on that.
Chair, yeah, given me a steer there. And yeah, I mean, there were different perspectives, and there is a lot of resilience still remaining in the sector, but obviously the fact that teachers cannot control the environment that they're working in the way that we all can when we're working at home, that creates a lot of risk for that cohort of people at work. So the summing up, you highlighted particularly guidance and requests for guidance on mass gatherings.
Folks, sorry to cut across you there, Clark. Members, could I just remind you to mute your devices if you're not speaking, please? Thanks. Thanks, Clark.
So, highlights of the request there were guidance on mass gatherings, particularly if open evenings where parents would usually take their children, if those are being kind of substituted by open tester days where a primary 7 class goes all together to a school, what is the safety guidance about that? An urgent need for more information and guidance on ventilation. So there is some guidance already, but not enough was the message. And primarily, I think the need for substitute cover and this suggestion from the unions of redeployment of teachers who are already trained up. Particularly, the unions weren't mitigating for a broad brush closure or anything. It was just what needs to happen if a substitute teacher is not in place when there's a class closure. Is it okay to close a class in those instances? So yeah, the shortage of staff, the pressure on school leaders. There's no cap on what they're required to do under the Jordanstown Agreement. No cap on their hours and things. And the message that contact tracing isn't working when you look at the level of infection that there has been more recently. So again, the committee has already asked for pupil surveillance update data from the Department of Health, and we'll be able to have a look at that soon. Plastic screens on teachers' desks was one of the very practical suggestions, and just good communication again between schools and the department as much as possible. So that's what I have, Chair. And I think writing to the Minister just to summarise those is probably the most straightforward way to convey, and also to refer the Minister to the watch again function where you can see the meeting again online and stop and start.
Thanks, Clark. Any members wish to add to that?
Chair, can I just add?
Yeah, Robin.
I didn't get the opportunity to come in again. Mr. Alastair Donaghy made reference to the PHA and their reports that schools are safe. Maxine Murphy-Higgins indicated that she would like stronger mitigations. In terms of the communication directly from the PHA and directly to individual schools, is it possible that we could write to PHA and ask them how that is achieved, how the communication between schools, principals and PHA is undertaken? Is it just as and when? What is the system for? In terms of the monitoring meters devices, my understanding, Chair, is that there are currently in storage a significant number of monitoring devices, but indeed that a very few schools have actually, proportionately, few schools have actually asked for those, but that might be something we would want to clarify as well, Chair.
Yep, happy to. I think that is a message that's coming from the Education Minister. Perhaps we could also ask the Education Minister what action is being taken to advise of the availability of CO2 monitors and/or to encourage the uptake of CO2 monitors. But CO2 monitors in and of themselves will alert schools to poor air quality. It won't do much to address the poor air quality, which is why I think so many members have been asking about the provision of air filtration devices, which is what we would want to ask about as well. But yeah, content to seek clarity on those issues, Robin.
Chair, could I just come in on that point?
Yeah, Pat, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, From
Sorry,
what I
just one second, Pat. I think Robin wanted to come back in, and then I'll bring you straight back in again. Sorry.
apologies.
No, it's okay. It's just the ventilation in schools, and again, I think my understanding, I think it's been said in the chamber that not a huge number of schools have actually contacted the Education Authority around the ventilation issues, but really just to seek clarity on those matters as well, Chair.
No problem. Thanks, Robin. Pat, Shane, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I mean, my understanding is that the South has made €30 million available for these HEPA air filtration systems. Now, I don't think for a minute that it's a silver bullet. I don't think there are any silver bullets, but I think there has to be a range of mitigations that maximise safety for staff and pupils in schools. And the air filtration systems and the CO2 monitors are just a couple of those mitigating measures that could be put in place. Thanks.
Thanks, Pat. Okay, members content to agree the actions? Agreed? Okay, Clark?
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, members, conscious assembly business has started. Is there any other business? No? Okay. Then our next meeting is tomorrow via Starleaf, 9:15 for 9:30 a.m. The committee meeting does now adjourn. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.